years. And for those who got to know him, he left us way too soon. Harry was a friend of mine. He was someone when I wanted to talk history, I could call. When there was a question about history, I could call him. His passion was second to none. And the thing I really liked about Harry, he was unique. If you got to see Harry, here's this vivacious guy with dreadlocks and passion and talking. And then when you dig into his history, to find out he's from Oklahoma, he was a Marine, worked his way as an enlisted man up to being an officer, and wanted to spread his knowledge of history and to make sure the history was accurate. One of the things I remember about Harry early on, we were talking about doing a program, and he said, let's make sure we're doing it right. And he always talked about his primary sources. He wanted to go back to the primary source to make sure we were telling history in the correct way. He didn't like when Hollywood would sort of tweak history a bit to make it fit their dialogue and not the true dialogue of history. And his passion was to make sure that we did it and we said it correctly. His other passion that I think some who got to know Harry would know is his real passion was to make sure that our youth were educated in history. And what drew me to Harry for us here in particular in Dauphin County was we have a great history in Dauphin County. It's a keystone state. It's the keystone county of our Commonwealth. And it's where a lot of movements started, whether it was the Underground Railroad, whether it was the proclamation or the emancipation going on, whether it's the USCT and the involvement of the USCT troops and their training right here at Camp Curtin. Harry wanted to make sure that the people knew our history and intertwined it, whether it was sexy or whether it wasn't, whether it was politically correct or it wasn't. He wanted to make sure that we got it right and that we passed it along in the correct way. And that's why I'm really, really proud of our library system for recognizing the contributions that Harry made, not only to us here in Dauphin County and helping to enlighten us and bring us a little closer to our own history, but also for sharing that across the nation. I remember one Saturday, I talked to Harry and he didn't even tell me about it. I clicked on the TV and there he was on the Bill O'Reilly show. The people that recognized his expertise and his passion was just astonishing. And he crossed all creeds, all colors, all races, all segments of our society. And he just had one passion, that was to tell our history, tell it completely, tell it accurately, and go back to primary sources. So again, I want to say thank you to the library board for this. And it's my pleasure at this time to turn the evening's program over to Karen Collings, our Executive Director of the Dauphin County Library System.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Commissioner Hayes. We very much thank the county for giving us the opportunity to launch this series and the special collection that supports it. So very much appreciate your comments. I'm the Executive Director, as mentioned, of the Dauphin County Library System. I welcome you all to our library's Zoom room. Like most of you, I think, I'm looking forward to the day that we can all be together in person to talk about important ideas like what we're going to discuss tonight. But in the meantime, I'm glad that we have this option available to us to safely get together and talk about such things. It's a particular pleasure to be opening up the Harry Jones Hidden Series again this year. This series is very near and dear to the library's heart, along with the collection, as I mentioned, that we've been developing to support it, for just the reasons that Commissioner Hayes just mentioned. Many of those values that Harry Jones held dear, we do as well as a public library system. He was a dynamic and energetic presenter who made history come alive, and we hope that you find that experience at the library. He was very focused on original sources, and we agree with that and want you to come to the library for credible and reliable sources for your information. And he was also, as Commissioner Hayes said, very much about making sure that these stories that we tell each other about who we are and where we're from, that we call history, are truly reflective of all the voices and the perspectives that were involved in making that history, and not just a select few. And we're committed to that here at the library system, and that's why this particular series is something that we hold as very special, and it's an honor to be opening it up tonight and to be introducing tonight's speaker. So joining us tonight is Christy S Coleman. She's a thought leader and influencer with a career that spans more than 30 years. And she's served as the Chief Executive Officer of some of the nation's most prominent museums. She's a tireless advocate for the power of museums, narrative correction, diversity, and inclusiveness. And she's also an innovator and a leader in the museum field. She's held leadership roles at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History, the American Civil War Museum, and now she's the executive director of the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation. Christy's written numerous articles. She's an accomplished screenwriter, public speaker, and she's appeared on several national news and history programs. Most recently, she served as the historical consultant for the film Harriet and Showtime's Good Lord Bird miniseries. She's also been a featured public historian for several documentaries, most recently the acclaimed miniseries Grant. Her decades of impact have been recognized with numerous awards, including honorary doctorates from the College of William and Mary, Virginia Commonwealth University, and the University of the South. And in 2018, Time magazine named Christy Coleman one of the 31 people changing the South. And in 2019, Worth magazine named her one of the 29 women changing the world. So I'm very eager to hear from her. I'm sure you are too. So without further ado, here's Christy Coleman. Welcome, Christy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. A very special thank you to the commissioner, to Ms. Daub. All of you have just been absolutely wonderful. And I would be remiss if I didn't take a moment to talk about my relationship with Harry as well. We were colleagues. We worked together so many times. And frankly, especially the 12 years that I spent with the American Civil War Museum and the work we did there in Richmond, I will tell you there are not very many African Americans, let alone people of color, working in the American Civil War space. And so Harry and I shared that commitment to correcting the narrative about the Civil War. He did it in DC and around the country, and I did it in the heart of the former capital of the Confederacy. So I got some stories that I could tell you, but that's not what I'm going to do tonight. What I'm going to do tonight and what we're going to talk about tonight is really why it is that when we talk about history, it becomes such a contentious and problematic thing. I'm sure you've all heard it time and time again. They're revising history. That's not what I learned when I was in school. That's not accurate. Where does that come from? That's not important. They keep changing this, that, and the other thing. So all of that said, guess what? You're right about all of it. Now, here's why history has to change. It changes because each generation asks a whole new series of questions. Each generation brings to it its values. And as academic historians and public historians alike, our responsibility is to take those questions and bring them to the fore, go back to the historical record, and build the narrative based on the needs of the communities that we serve. Because here's the thing. History has never been for the dead. I want to repeat that. History has never been for the dead. The challenge and the way that we all need to think about this is that it is a three-prong approach. Prong number one is the history itself. That is the record that has been left to us. And I want to be really careful that you understand when I say the historical record. That historical record may be letters, diaries, newspapers, images, paintings, archaeology. Now we add to the mix DNA evidence. We add to the mix the importance of understanding oral histories. One of the craziest things that I think impacted our field for a long time is that people did not want to take oral histories to to have the power that they do, when there are communities throughout the world to which the word, the spoken word, has so much power. As a matter of fact, in several Central West African nations, there is a proverb that says there is nothing worse than a thief but a liar, because so much is dependent on passing things down from one generation to the next orally, in addition to the things that are created that are reflective of that. And so as you think through that reality of what the forensic evidence has left us, when we have questions, we can go back to that evidence to re-examine. For example, if you are of a certain age, what working class people or poor people were doing at times of crisis in this nation's building was not a part of the story. It was always about the wealthy, the powerful, the politically connected, is how we viewed things in a historical lens. But what we fail to understand is that what happens in communities, what happens in nation states, is driven by what is happening in those communities, all kinds of communities, right? There is this extraordinary movement back and forth where a powerful, well-connected person can very much drive the way a community responds, and vice versa. A community that is experiencing a crisis or wanting to solve a problem will actually create its leaders from the ground up. All right. So when the decision was made, and I guess I shouldn't say the decision, but when the questions started to arise in the mid-1960s, this is an era of historiography referred to as the age of social history, when we wanted to know what was it like for the common man, what was it like for the common woman, and that movement then took on other tenors. Well, what was going on with indigenous people beyond what we've been told? What was going on with African Americans? What was going on with Italians and Germans and this and that? Well, what about LGBTQ people, which is a phenomenon more of the 20th century? Where have we been in this story? And so every time those questions are asked, again, scholars go back to the public record, go back to that forensic record, and re-examine and enrich our understanding. And as that is happening, as those sources are being compiled, as those sources are being debated and discussed and looked at in a larger scope, we then have a responsibility, those of us on the public history side of the equation. We have the responsibility at that point to make sure that this new scholarship is present in our exhibits and our programs, right? That's our responsibility as public historians. And unfortunately, what happens in the public history sphere is that we are often at least 5 years behind what the latest scholarship says. And your textbook is going to be at least 10 years behind. Because, most states, when they look at redoing or rethinking about editions of the textbook, well, they only revisit these things every few years. Right? So you got to wait for the next cycle, and then they got to debate, and textbooks more often than not end up being political instruments. I hate to say it, if you are not working directly with the academic work. And I was so surprised by that when I started looking at Virginia's standards of learning and understood how the process worked. And that's when we decided as an institution, when I decided as its leader, that you know what, we're not going to wait to scream and holler and tell them, that's wrong after it's printed. We need to be on the front end before it's ever printed. And that becomes, I think, the greater responsibility of us and, again, academics and public history, to make sure that these elements of heritage keeping that aren't necessarily historical are corrected. Now, I mentioned there are 3 things, and I just mentioned number 2. Okay, it's about heritage making. Heritage making is a different beast. Heritage making is actually a reconciled agreement over what happened. and what lessons we as a community are going to tell ourselves about what happened, so that we can continue to thrive as a community, to lead as a community, or whatever that is. So history and heritage are not necessarily the same thing. And you will hear people all the time talk about, they're trying to destroy my history. They're trying to destroy my heritage. History doesn't get destroyed. Heritage can be chipped at. And the reason is because it is a consensus narrative that a community may need for one reason or another. And I'm going to give you examples of all of this shortly. Third part of this triumvirate is what quite simply can only be called memory. A person's personal connection to a historical past, their particular memory. And the best example that I could give, and again, for people of a certain age, I say to them, okay, do you remember exactly where you were and what happened when the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and all of that was attacked on September 11th? Do you remember where you were, what you heard, and what happened in the immediate days after that? And if you are of a certain age, you absolutely can answer that question. It was a terrifying time. People know exactly where they were. And then I say, okay, now imagine what would happen if we decided to tell the history of 9/11 from your point of view. What's missing from the story? And unfortunately, that's what we do a lot of the time. When we choose to say we only want to talk about the men who, were involved in the Constitutional Convention, when we're talking about the politics of building a new nation and having to go from Articles of Confederation to actually building the US Constitution. And there's a lot of things that happen in communities that drive who gets sent to that Continental Congress. There's a lot that is happening in the post days of the war with Britain. There is a lot of violence that is still taking place between patriots and Tories on the ground. So we miss something when we are not as expansive in understanding the totality. We instead look at this thing and say, oh, that's a circle, and I understand all the sides of that circle and what's in the middle, when really what you're holding in your hand, if you allow yourself, is you're holding a sphere. But most of us don't take the time or the energy to turn it because we are so fixated either on our particular memory of it, so therefore that's exactly how it happened, or we're so fixed on what we have decided as a community is going to help us best. But that's not going to help us learn and grow as a nation state. And here's why. I can guarantee you your memory of 9/11 and your memory of its aftermath and the things that have impacted our society moving forward, like the fact you have to take your shoes off at the airport, the fact that we have scanners, that you can't have people, go with you to the gate anymore. There are some of us, those of us that are in our 50s, we remember when you could just take your whole family with you to the gate and they could kiss you goodbye as you walked onto the plane. Those days are over. There's a reason for that. As we look at the particular events of that day, most Americans, I can guarantee you, do not know why Al-Qaeda chose September 11th as the date for their attack. They don't know. They don't think it's important, but it has historical roots that we don't talk about because, well, we just don't, because that's just not how we think about the aftermath of World War I. It's not how we do it. It's not how we think about, American interests and other Western interests in Northern Africa and throughout the continent. We just don't process it that way. But for those people and in their history, that date was significant. And so it took almost at least 10 years after the incident for a museum to even start making its way to even commemorate what happened in 9/11. And even then, social interest, community interest greatly gripped hold of how that story was going to be. There were people who did not even want the imagery of the 18 hijackers that were on those 2 planes that hit the World Trade Center to even be seen or known, did not even want that to be a part of the telling of the 9/11 Memorial Museum about this extraordinary event in American history. Now, things have eased over time, but this is where, again, that memory and that heritage and the forensic history all begin to collide. Now, if we do our jobs well, what ends up happening is, with, again, each of those new generations of questions and even the memory that you hold, if you take that memory as that guiding point, and sometimes that memory can be something as wonderfully simple as when I was a kid and I went to Colonial Williamsburg, I got to watch people churn butter and make candles. And so when I took my kids back to Colonial Williamsburg and I went looking for the candle making and the butter churning, and they told me we don't do that anymore, I was mad, because they have changed my history. Well, here's the thing, y'all. The historical record says people didn't have to do that in the capital city of the wealthiest of the 13 colonies in 1776. They didn't have to. They could go to the store and buy it. It was brought in from their other properties. They didn't do that. They didn't have to. Soap making and candle making, they bought it at the store, or they had it brought in from, again, their plantation. So that activity historically wasn't accurate, but it's a pleasant memory as a childhood. And it builds this heritage idea that that was a simpler, greater time. And we convince ourselves that just about everybody would have these fancy, lovely gowns and riding around in carriages, and wouldn't it be great? And they'd be, and guess what? Here's the other fun part, and why I decided I wanted to go into public history. Come to find out that that wonderful, wonderful museum known as Colonial Williamsburg, well, on the eve of the American Revolution, every other face that you would have seen walking the streets of Williamsburg would have been Black. In fact, a little bit more than that. 52% of the population of Williamsburg at the eve of the American Revolution were Black people, enslaved and free, but every other face. Now, what happens to our view of heritage if we physically saw that? What would it do to our mindset and our memory point if we were immediately faced with the realities of that era? Because the forensic history has always been there, speaking to who those people were and what they did and who their enslavers were. And connections, the DNA tells us even more. Even though in some cases, the historical record also talked of those familial connections. You see how this works? So I'm going to give you a couple others. This is one of my favorites of late. And I wish I could see you all. So I'm going to ask you to do so. I don't know if you can do it down here. I saw a raised hand thing before, but I don't think I can see it anymore. Let me see if I can change my view. Hold on a second. No, I can't change my view. Doggone it. Okay, anyway, here we go. How many of you growing up heard one of two things? George Washington couldn't tell a lie, and he had wooden teeth, and he chopped down a cherry tree. How many of you heard that growing up? Nod, raise your hand. Guess what? None of that is true. Okay? None of that is true. As a little boy, he did not chop down any cherry tree. There is nothing in the historical record that makes that true. It was a made-up story to advance an idea that George Washington was this infallible individual, the father of our country, could not tell on us. So honest, he never told a lie. Well, he's a politician. right? He's a human being. Science tells us we all lie at some level every single day, at least 100 times a day. That's what science tells us. And we sit there and we go, oh, I don't do that. But we're talking about big lies. You probably don't do the big lies, but you probably do the little lies. The little lies like, you know, honey, do you like this outfit? Yeah, you know, it looks nice. Yeah, sure. Lies, right? Or does this taste good? Yeah, it's pretty good. You know, you could use a little more salt, but it's good. It's just the nature of how we as a species choose to keep a peace and to keep a positive energy in our space. And that's not a bad thing. It is part of our collective ability to advance as a species. It's one of our protective things, if you will. Now, out and out, blasphemous, outrageous lying and just making stuff up because, you know, you're trying to control, that's different energy. And that's not what I'm talking about. So there's the first thing. He didn't chop down a cherry tree when he was a kid, and he could not tell a lie, which he could. Okay, lies of omission as well. The third thing about the wooden teeth, though, is really interesting because museums, we've had 2 sets of George Washington's false teeth in our collections for a very long time. One pair is at Mount Vernon, and the other pair is at the National Dental Museum. Neither of them are wood. They are made of ivory, and they are made of human teeth. Human teeth that he got from his enslaved population that were produced by his French doctor, his French dentist. Now, what does that tell us? Knowing that fact, that his teeth were made from the teeth of his enslaved people. Well, it reinforces an idea of the era that when it came to enslavement and the way that Africans and their descendants were regarded, everything about them and their lives and their bodies were owned by someone else, even down to their teeth were available for his use. And yes, people wrote about that, and some people felt that it was, you know, mostly because they were teeth from the enslaved versus from other white people. You know, there is a wonderful essay about this by a scholar, female scholar that I'm sorry, I can't remember her name. It just jumped out of my head, but it's worth looking at. It's really an extraordinary piece. But again, Mount Vernon has known this the whole time, but they were able to, and for a long time, they perpetuated the heritage making when people would ask the question and they would say, oh yeah, he absolutely had wooden teeth. They'd lie. Or in some cases, they did even more absurd. They actually sold magnets up until last year. Last year, they were called out on it by a scholar who was visiting and was stunned to see that their museum shop was actually selling reproductions of those teeth as magnets, as a joke. Of course, you know, once it was brought to the new executive director's attention, he had it removed. But the point is, that's how things can get really twisted in this differentiation between history and heritage. And so I just say that as we think through this, and we're having conversations with our friends and our family who may, again, go off on a tangent about, you know, revising history, that you help them understand this piece, if nothing else, that there's 3 parts to it. And we do create memory and we do create heritage for a reason, but it doesn't make it right. So our hope, in the museum space anyway, is that we can help you create memories where you are enhancing your understanding of the heritage that you've grown up with new information, because we are creating new memory for you. And as we're creating new memory for you, that you and your community are deciding together that that heritage that you've been taught all your life needs to be modified. It needs to be changed. It needs to be more reflective. Yes, we need stories that help us understand ourselves and address the issues. But the old saying that, you know, if we don't know our history, we're doomed to repeat it. You know, well, it doesn't hold water if the history that you're teaching, if the heritage that you're sharing is not based on a historical truth. It becomes harmful, not just for the people that it leaves out of the equation, but it becomes harmful because of the misinformation that's moved on, which is why we saw such virulent, and this is going to be my last portion here, why we saw such virulent reaction in the last 2 years to two really important events that have taken place. One is the presence of specifically Confederate statuary in the public space. And the second is around the second is more recent as we think through how we want to, again, commemorate what happens with when people die, when these histories are told. With the, you know, I was when I was CEO of the American Civil War Museum, I had been asked by the governor to serve on a statewide commission, and had also been asked to specifically serve on the City of Richmond's Monument Avenue Commission. And during the course of that, we got thousands of letters, and we read every single one to get the sentiment of the people who were sending them in. And we gridded them out, and we held public forums with thousands of people that showed up for that. We had online resources. We partnered with the cultural and academic communities in Richmond to help provide additional information and background on the histories of each and every statue and their subjects. We had already done a significant amount of work of reframing what the Civil War was really about based on the historical record. And believe me when I tell you, the heritage making was deliberate misinformation. It was deliberate in the immediate aftermath of the war. So much so that there was actually a catechism for Southern children that said, reject Southern white children. It applied to everybody, but in the South. Reject any book that names any of the leaders of the Confederacy as traitors to the United States. Reject any book that says that they were not kind and loving to their slaves. Reject any, I mean, this was the catechism, these were the rules. So no wonder we have generations of people over the last 150 years who have been taught a heritage that is not rooted, not strongly rooted anyway, in the historical record. Because the historical record, Southerners, Confederate supporting Southerners, white Southerners were very clear. Even the non-slave holding class were very clear about what this was about. And so, and I can say that with extraordinary confidence because, as some of you may or may not know, in 2013, the American Civil War Center at Tredegar, where I was the CEO, and the Museum of the Confederacy, which my colleague Wade Rawls was the CEO, we merged our two institutions to create the American Civil War Museum. And it was a lot of work behind the scenes, but we were committed to a new mission. We were committed to a complete story that, again, corrected the historical narrative using that forensic evidence. We were able to tell new stories through a plethora of artifacts and letters and diaries. That archive was extraordinary, and 95% of it was collected between 1880 and 1890. And they opened their doors as the Confederate Museum in 1896. Those women were able to gather all, when I tell you all except one of every Confederate general's private papers and uniforms. The uniform they didn't get was A.P. Hill because he was buried in it, but they got his other stuff. It is an extraordinary collection, extraordinary collection. And through that collection, we were able to really discern extraordinary stories, not only about the Confederacy, but about the war in general, and particularly about African Americans, because they are in the peripheral edges of that documentation of what's going on, who these people are. The myth of the Black Confederate is new. They didn't want Black Confederate soldiers fighting in the Civil War, but Harry already told you that. So I'm not going to repeat it here. My point is, that's just one example about how heritage making can be detrimental to the overall health of a nation state that has chosen instead to follow a path of untruths or half-truths to create something new that is palatable to deal with its trauma, rather than dealing with the actual afterfacts so we can learn from it and resolve these issues that continue to plague us across the society. And frankly, here's the other thing that's really interesting to me. And I'm looking at the time, and I want to be sensitive to the timing that we have left. As a closing comment, I will say this. For those, again, who feel like their history or their heritage is being taken away from them, I say this to you. Imagine how people feel, Americans whose families have also been here for generations, of various forms of freedom and unfreedom, enslavement and wealth or whatever, who were deliberately removed from the narrative. Imagine how they feel to be told generation after generation that you really don't matter, that your people really don't matter. Because that's essentially what happened. A decision was made that these stories, unless they could fit the narrative that we needed to build for ourselves as a nation state, that those stories were going to be in conflict with how we wanted to present ourselves. And so now that I'm at the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation, I've been with the organization for just a little over a year and maybe 2 weeks. And so dealing with the nation's founding is now a really interesting dynamic. Because again, we have this mythology about colonialism. We've come to accept certain elements about the treatment of indigenous people. We have come to an understanding about that. And there's even some apologists about that to a certain degree. I actually saw a man walking around in a t-shirt that said the land wasn't stolen, it was conquered. And I was blown away by that t-shirt. The colonization of North America by European interests were business enterprises. The London Company, the Virginia Company, the Boston Company, the Massachusetts Company, the Dutch Company, the French Crown, all of them came into North America, Central and South America with one goal: to gain wealth for themselves as Europe was going through this period of internal strife and wanting wealth building. That's what it was about. These were business interests. People actually bought stock, literal stock, into the success of these colonies. It was a capitalist enterprise. And yes, there were smaller groups that would eventually come over after these colonies get a level of success, like, German immigrants German Lutherans who are escaping certain persecution. The Pilgrims and the Puritans are slightly two different groups, but also who come over because they are considered fringe religious organizations, right? And then there are colonies that are established, like Georgia, as a place, in western parts of Virginia, the colony of Virginia, that were used as a place for criminals, for petty criminals, to get them out of Europe. So send them to America, let them work the land there, and maybe they can prove themselves. That's our real history, right? And so it's going to be fun, I think, exploring these ideas. And again, the thing is, the truth is, none of this is really ignoble. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. What I'm saying is we've really got to understand the genesis of this, that the genesis of the nation was an exploitation of land and labor. And if we understand that and we make a decision that that is no longer the way that we want to function, that we really do want to live up to the ideals that we've identified as a nation of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that all people are created equal. If we really want to create that kind of space as a nation, then we really need to understand the genesis of the structures and the systems that have been put in place that keep us from being even greater. So don't make the mistake of thinking that those of us who are challenging and wanting to correct heritage narratives don't love our country, because we do. We just want her to be well and healthy. And so with that, I'm going to stop. And thank you all so much for your time and attention. And I'm going to go to the Q&A box and see what I've got in there. We have Keith Mitchell ask the first question. Ms. Coleman, for the record, please identify the reason for the Civil War. The 11 states that would form the Confederate States of America all make very clear in their Articles of Secession that the reason that they are going to war is to preserve their sacred institutions, and many of them, actually most of them, are very specific. Slavery is the cause of the American Civil War. Tariffs, states' rights, all of those things are all reflective of the underlying issue for them all. The tariffs were related to the products that are being produced by slaves that were threatening to be taxed. The states' rights issue, which is very interesting because the first states to actually argue a states' rights case were actually Pennsylvania and New York. And they argued states' rights in the 1850s after Southern influence and the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. And they said, our states have already mandated that slavery is not going to be legal in our state, and therefore our states' rights, any enslaved person who crosses our border under our states' rights, under our rules, are in fact free people. And we are not going to use our resources to return them to slavery. That was the first time that a states' rights argument was made. When the South decided to secede, well, that was a really interesting thing. They used a states' rights argument. It is the state's right to keep slavery. I could tell you so much more, but again, the historical record is very clear on this one. I have a question here from Sheila Dow Ford. Thank you very much. The false narrative created, I assume, mythical history of the South continues to inform and haunt America. How do we come to terms with this? It will destroy us if we do not confront it. Again, I think part of this conversation also has to do with how we are choosing to deal with what's on our public landscape. I think every community needs to decide for itself where these types of monuments and statuary are, because they are not subtle. Some of them are really quite, and you read you read the inscriptions on them, and they're really quite something very interesting. And one place that I absolutely, so you have a couple choices there, right? You either take them down, you add signage so that people really understand what was going on there and use them as public teaching spaces. But the one space that I will absolutely say that I personally do not believe that those statues belong is in front of courthouses and seats of government that are supposed to be for everyone. But they were placed specifically in those places because they were gathering places and they were places of authority. And so to place a Confederate statuary, especially in the South, where there are large populations that are majority African American, it was a reassertion of white supremacy in the post-Reconstruction era is when most of those went up. So these were not outside of a cemetery, these statues were not put up as some, you know, peaceful reminder memorial. They had a much more important and pervasive power. And you see that when you look very carefully at the spike in their their thing. And the whole of America, by the way, was involved in the making of them, by the way. There were mold makers and art shops in New York and Boston, that studios that produce these generic soldier or sailor monuments, and then you would choose, if you were a small community, you would choose what kind of accoutrement you wanted on the statue, and then they would mold that and put it on there and ship it down there to you. Mass produced. A lot of them were mass produced. So, you know, this is how we deal with this as Americans. I think, again, we have to just go back to the forensic record, and we have to reconcile that forensic record in each of our communities to help us better understand. And that process is just beginning, because we're, again, I think we finally reached a point where the voiceless are speaking and are letting it be known. But do not mistake for one moment that there wasn't opposition to these statuary going up at the time that they were being placed, because there absolutely was. We have Confederate statues in parts of America that weren't even states or territories, right? During the course of the war. That's what's absolutely stunning when you think about it. Boy, the questions are peaking up. Okay, so let me go a little bit faster and make my answers a little shorter. Mark Logan, Ms. Coleman, why do we not honor the abolitionist John Brown during Black History Month? Quite a few people do honor John Brown during Black History Month and every other time of the year. John Brown is a really interesting figure, and I think he's getting more and more play. He was definitely honored by abolitionists during the time. They made songs about him. He's a hero of Black America. And then there's this period where, you know, he falls out of favor. They tried to paint him as a crazy person. And quite frankly, as the popularity of the myth of the lost cause took hold in the American imagination through films like Gone with the Wind, John Brown lost favor, as did General Grant, who was a huge American hero until we got to about the 1940s. So there we go. Because Ms. Ford, because you already asked a question, I'm gonna go on to somebody else. Scott Hancock, I found the 1619 project as public history to be useful in many respects. Do you think any of the criticisms by more conservative historians have any merit in prompting people to think about the distinction you mentioned between history and heritage? And I'm not referring to any of the critiques by some political figures, but those by actual historians. Well, here's the thing: the conservative historians that you're talking about that came out against the 1619 project. So here's the thing: the 1619 project, which the 1619 project is brilliant in terms of a piece of public history. It is natural for there to be debates around a new thesis or a piece as powerful as that. But I will tell you that the vast majority of the academic public, the overall premise, they do not disagree with. Certain elements and connections they may have problems with. Even those on the liberal side of the spectrum, if you want to say that, but it's where the evidence leads. And so what I found most interesting about some of the early critique against Hannah's work and that team of those more conservative scholars was that they essentially were saying, no, Black people in America really didn't matter. That's what they were saying. And that again goes against the historical record as I'm seeing it right now. Reading John Smith's treatise on Virginia, 1624. John Rolfe, the Virginia colony is struggling up until 1619 when these Africans are brought there in exchange for goods. Africans were growing tobacco. Natives were growing tobacco. John Rolfe gets a hybrid product from the Caribbean that is being grown and brings it to Virginia, where the enslaved population, or brings it to Virginia to try to plant it. They realize it's highly popular. People in Europe love it, and they need labor, and the native people are not going to provide it. So when the Africans arrive and know how to grow it, know how to farm it, Virginia becomes very successful very fast. And so again, the historians who have gone against, the more conservative historians who have gone against it, are really being dismissive of that real reality, what actually happened. And yeah, there are different things that happen across all of the colonies in terms of their ultimate success, but it is Virginia's success that provides a tremendous amount of wealth that ends up developing sort of trades among these various colonies, and ultimately, obviously, back to England, because that's where the money was supposed to go. So it is a pivotal point, and the decision that sort of laissez-faire response of the crown to that, until the colonies themselves really start pushing and advocating for African slavery, is an astonishing thing. But there's more there. I think, again, criticism of the project is healthy and should happen anytime there's a new monograph that is produced. And the 1619 project was brilliant because it got people talking about this in a different way through this thesis. And again, most scholars think it is, it's 90% right. It just hasn't ever been framed the way that they framed it, through that particular lens. Okay, so Sandra Gunning, how are you dealing with pressure from people who feel that any discussion of the negatives, i.e. colonialism, slavery, racism, etc., is wrong? How much pressure are they exerting in the museum context? I think the pressures tend to be more political. And in my particular case, I feel a little insulation from that, simply because, as I jokingly say, they know who they hired and my record in terms of narrative correction. And so this idea that we shouldn't talk about the negatives is sort of that rose-colored glasses environment. And I don't know how I don't know how a society gets well if it is not addressing the harms that it has caused on its own people, and or continue to cause because of the structures that are put in place. I just don't know how you do that, and I will be doing that and talking about that for a very long time. Will you discuss the contributions of Harry's research? Do you have a perspective on reparations? That's from Sherry Randolph. Harry, because he was such an extraordinary advocate for the Black Civil War soldier and the role of Black men and women during the American Civil War, contributed immeasurably to our field, to give us those rich individual stories of African Americans in the course of the war. Why are museums such an important part of the historical narrative, and how do they stay on top of new findings? It really varies by the institution. I will tell you that of the 35,000 museums in the United States, about 19,000 are history museums, the majority of which operate on budgets less than $250,000 a year. So oftentimes they can't stay on top of everything as much as they may want to. They can't, so they partner. They do a variety of things to help advance individuals, do the reading on their own. Now it's a lot easier to share information through social media, and I'm on Twitter a lot because that's where I can find out who just dropped the latest book and what people are thinking about. It's a great place. You can follow the hashtag Twitter Historians, and you can find all kinds of juicy stuff that's going on out there in terms of work that's being done. So that's how you do it. You stay on top. But like any job, any career that you love, you stay on top of what's happening in your field, and that's just how it's done. Mr. Beneventano, What is the best way for educators and others to help people deal with their heritage if they are related to CSA veterans or those who are related to enslavers? Look, I mean, I'm related to both of those too, you know, through a white ancestor. And so how do we relate to that? How do we deal with that? And I imagine what you're talking about here is, you know, if that's something that you feel shame or guilt about, I would say it is the actions that you do moving forward that should define you. If you are still living in a space where you are taking advantage or have an advantage of that slaveholding class, which is highly possible you do across the generations, and you acknowledge that, and you're doing things like, well, we don't want to build affordable housing in our neighborhood because our property values are going down, and you're perpetuating something, right? So I would say, you know, really look at what you're may inadvertently be doing, where the blind spots may be in the present. Understand that historical connection. Understand, for God's sake, please understand that structural racism and inequity are real. They are not imaginations of the woke left or whatever new insult folks try to create. They are very, very real. Just this week, there was just this simple story that is just blown up that some of you may have seen, where this Black couple had their house appraised and got one number, and then had their white friend come in and be with the next appraiser, and the house was appraised for $500,000 more. Same exact house. The difference, Black families in one of them, they think of white families in the other one. That's structural racism, because it's impacting generational wealth. It's impacting credit and access to credit. It's impacting potentially interest rates. That's structural. It's those kinds of things that we need to take a close look at, and their genesis. That's where we need to go. As a high school student, this is an anonymous attendee in college history course, what advice would you give when researching certain topics and finding truthful information? Primary sources are always the key, darling. Your local libraries, your local archives, your state courthouses all have this primary information for you to work from. Emily Jumba, you mentioned how history is always changing and how the museums try to change the memories that people make to be more historically accurate. Could you please describe the process a little more and how you track down the more accurate information? Again, what I'm talking about here is, you know, museums are often lagging behind. We're trying to close the gap, but museums are often lagging behind more recent scholarship. It just takes time for us to process that, raise the money to build a new exhibit so that you, the public, can come and see that. That is not an instantaneous thing. It takes time to plan it, to build it, to vet it, to do all the things that need to happen. So, and again, the history, the narrative is expanding. Okay, the narrative is expanding. And yes, earlier understandings may change based on, again, all of those new questions that we're asking that may reveal something different. And so our understanding of something prior can change. And so that is happening all the time. And I would just say, I used to be able to say, watch the History Channel, but they got, you know, aliens and everything else going on over there sometimes. So that's my little joke. Sorry, I like the History Channel too. But I think, you know, the process is one where the information is still always going to be there. It's just what questions are you asking and what new thing are you trying to learn? We are nearing the end here. It's 8:03. I know I've gone over my time. I'm going to try to answer one more question, and I've tried to take these in order. There's some here that look a little similar. Here's a good one. How has social media changed the approach to passing history on to younger generations? specifically has omnipresent distraction and demand for instantaneous information diluted the ability to teach history in a deliberate and contemplative manner. I think social media has actually done two things. It has allowed people to be very selective in their curation of content. And so those who do not have the discipline and understanding of the range of scholarship and source material knowledge that is required can go into the historical record and pick and cherry pick, just like they do with the Holy Book, what they need to advance their particular agenda. Serious scholarship means that you are looking at the breadth of the data to see what the pattern is, not trying to create one. And so social media, again, has done that on one level, but it's also made the process of history, I think, far more accessible. And most important, it's made those records far more accessible. The digital age has made all of those records, they're no longer kept in some dusty thing. There are online archives that give the people access and the power to see those source materials. But as a layperson, just as they do when you're a student, there are certain folks that you just got to read when you're getting started to sort of lay that foundation of understanding the breadth of a cycle, of a period. And then you're able to go to the record and look for those specificities. And on that note, I'm going to stop. And again, thank you all so much for your time and your attention and your interest. And I hope that this hour that we've spent together in honor of Harry Jones, that I have lived up to your expectation, and that we have an opportunity to engage at another time. Thank you so much to all of the fine folk associated with Dauphin County Library. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join you today.